Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel on net zero agriculture, the challenges facing our food chain. We will be hearing from three experts who will tackle one of the most important problems of our time, food security. As climate change increasingly impacts the food supply chain, and in turn the food chain puts more and more pressure on our planet, it's an issue that the science and agricultural communities are racing to solve. We'd love to hear your comments as we work through today's panel and of course after we conclude the session. So please do share them on social media, tagging RSK Group and using the hashtag Green Dialogues. You can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook by searching RSK Group. But first, a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. All attendees' microphones are automatically muted throughout the webinar. During the presentation, you can post questions and there will be a Q&A session at the end of all of our presentations, so we do encourage you to post questions. As many questions as possible will be answered, and those that can't be answered due to time constraints will be answered after the webinar by our experts. Shortly after we conclude the session, you will receive a link to a short survey, and if you could take a few minutes to provide feedback, we can improve on our future webinars. First up, we have Sarah Wynn, who I will invite on camera. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
So Sarah is Managing Director of Climate and Sustainability at RSK ADAS. She has 18 years of experience working to improve the sustainability of agricultural crop and livestock production. In recent years, she's had a particular focus on reducing the climate impact of agricultural production and looking at strategies to reduce on-farm emissions. She works with the supply chain to help it move towards net zero food production, although does realise that this is a massive challenge in a natural system, and so aims to find practical solutions to help minimise climate impact. Sarah, thank you for kicking us off, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So I'm going to talk today about some of the drivers. Most of us are already very familiar with them. We'll just make sure we are talking about the same thing. We'll define what net zero is. What does it really look like in terms of agriculture and the supply chain? Think about some of the key contributors, and then start to think about some of the solutions. So we're all, I hope, aware of the Paris Agreement. It was signed by almost 200 countries in 2015 and is a legally binding treaty that is aiming to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably below 1.5. We're starting to see net zero legislation come into place across multiple geographies, with net zero legislation in the UK having been established in 2019. And this legislation is setting the target for us to achieve net zero by 2050 in the UK, and it's affecting all sectors, including food and agriculture. We're also starting to see increasing consumer and peer pressure for companies, organisations and individuals to be seen to act. We're starting to see things like the Science Based Targets initiative that is demonstrating clear and robust emissions reductions. So the challenge that we face, and this is based on a paper that was published by JRC at the beginning of this year, is that food production accounts for about a third of total global emissions. That's 18 gigatons of greenhouse gases in 2015. So when we're looking at food production, we are looking at a very significant proportion of the emissions that are affecting our planet. And food production is made up of multiple elements, but it's important to realise that these elements are not all equal, and the land-based part of the overall emissions accounts for about 2/3 of total emissions from food production. And if we look at this graphic that comes from that JRC report, the length of the lines in here demonstrates the proportion of the emissions coming from each part of the supply chain. That very first section is the land use change piece. And remember, these are global emissions. So this includes land use change in places such as South America where we're seeing deforestation in order to create land for producing crops and livestock. But we also get emissions from this area associated with how we manage the land, so the way we cultivate soils, the way we manage our grasslands. And if you're causing an erosion of carbon, that will also contribute to that piece. When we're looking at the farm and the agricultural production, that accounts for about 40% of the emissions from food production. And that's including all the emissions associated with the raw materials that go into food production, the emissions that occur as a result of it, the nitrous oxide, the methane, etc. And then the remaining third of the emissions sit within the processing, transport, retail, packaging, consumption, and disposal of food waste. So any company that is sitting in that part of the supply chain can only do a relatively small amount within house without supporting action in wider agriculture. So what is net zero? Well, first off, greenhouse gas emissions are the losses of greenhouse gases. Particularly in agriculture, we're looking at carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide to the atmosphere as a result of the activity, the production of the food. When we're looking at agricultural supply base, it's important to realise that actually agricultural land is a massive store of carbon. And Anne will talk more about this later on. But this store needs to be protected and is therefore an important part of the activities that take place on the farm, is making sure we don't lose anything from that store. And then carbon sequestration is the active removal of carbon from the atmosphere and locking it up long term in either vegetation or soil organic carbon in order to reduce the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what we're aiming to do as a part of net zero is to move from a position where emissions exceed sequestration to the point where we're able to reduce emissions sufficiently to enable us to balance them with sequestration. So if we didn't do anything, what would it look like in order to get to net zero? Well, what I've done is I've looked at a recent report that's been produced that identified emissions per tonne of production for milk, chicken and pork in the UK. And I've also taken a figure from a report that's yet to be published for wheat. And then I've looked at what total production of those products is within the UK and calculated total emissions, which amounts to about 37 million tonnes, sorry. And if we were to try and just balance that now by planting trees, based on the fact that trees capture between 5.9 and 11 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year, we'd need over 6.4 million hectares of native woodland to balance those emissions. And quite simply, we do not have that land area available to both grow trees and produce food. So it's really important that we find ways to decarbonise our food production, because we can't balance it all using sequestration. This chart again from the JRC report demonstrates where the emissions are coming from within the agricultural supply chain and the flows of those emissions through the different sectors, stages and categories. And if we look closer at what we can do within the individual elements, there are some things that are easy wins. These include things like the decarbonisation of energy production. So a significant chunk of the emissions is coming from energy consumption. And as we move towards increased use of renewable energy, research and development into alternative low carbon fuels, those technological developments will help us to decarbonise the food supply chain. We also face some biological challenges though. So things like the use of nitrogen fertiliser is really critical to ensuring that we maintain good yields. But nitrogen fertiliser is associated with high levels of emissions from both its manufacture and its application. Now, work is ongoing within the fertiliser industry to decarbonise the manufacture and production of fertiliser. And we're looking at technologies that can help to reduce emissions associated with application, things such as nitrification inhibitors. And these are expected to become more widely used in the future. But it still will remain important to find ways to optimize the use of nitrogen in crops to make sure that we've got minimal losses to the environment. Methane is the other big challenge that we face, predominantly produced as a result of ruminant livestock and their enteric fermentation. It can be addressed partly through efficiency of production, making sure that we are not getting waste within the system. We're producing livestock as quickly and efficiently as possible with low mortality and high health. We can look at changing feeds such that the way that the animal digests the feed within the rumen is modified and reduces methane. And then there's various different technologies that are being developed to tackle methane production within the rumen, including inhibitors of various types. And then the big elephant in the room really is deforestation and how we address that. It's a global challenge. When we're looking within our supply chains, we can make sure that we're sourcing responsibly, purchasing ingredients from areas that are not affected by climate change. But we also need to think about how the actions that we take within our supply chains will impact on productivity. So if you take an action, say reduce nitrogen, that results in a reduction in in yield, but you still need the same amount of product, then you're going to get land use change somewhere else to maintain your production. At present, the current technologies do not allow us to complete removal of nitrous oxide, methane, and even all the carbon dioxide from agricultural production. So we're going to need to become far more efficient in what we produce and the way we produce it, reducing waste, etc. And then we need to think about how we can balance those residual emissions through planting trees, peatland restoration, etc. But the challenge is big, and we need to make sure that we're reducing our emissions by as much as possible, such that there's an opportunity to balance them with sequestration. And I mentioned some of the technologies that are coming along. For example, the inhibitors. There are various different inhibitors that are being developed, and there's various evidence out there. You've got nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors, and these are able to deliver reasonably good levels of reduction. They don't completely eliminate nitrous oxide, but they can significantly reduce it. We also have technologies such as green ammonia, enhanced nitrogen availability in slurries, etc., through things like N2 applied, that enable us to either make better use of the manures that we've got or reduce the embedded emissions associated with manufacture. I also mentioned the various methane inhibitors. There are a lot of them that are in development. Some of them have got approval for use, some of them are still very much in development. But this is expected to be an area of increasing interest going forwards as we try to maintain the ability to produce cattle, but lower their overall impact. And finally, we could think a bit more laterally in terms of how we provide some of the nutrition that we get, whether that is directly into the human food chain or whether it is indirectly through the livestock supply chain, but thinking about alternative protein sources, things like insect protein, microbial protein, or algal protein are all things that are being investigated at the moment to determine how they could be implemented at scale and the potential environmental impacts of them. But I think it's also important when we're thinking about agriculture and food to not just look at the farm gate. We need to think about what it is we're eating and whether we're eating the right things. We need to make sure we're reducing waste, and that's at all levels in the supply chain, the farm, the factory, retail, and consumer waste, because any waste we have is an emission that could be avoided otherwise. When you think about how much we eat, especially in the West, we've got excess calories being consumed, of potentially the wrong types of food. So can we balance our diets better to ensure that we are healthier, but also to minimize the waste calories that are going into the system and the waste emissions that we're consuming? We're also seeing strong drivers to change what we eat, to become more environmentally conscious of what we eat. There are strong drivers pushing towards lower meat consumption. So should we be aiming for less meat, but of a higher quality, for example? And on the left, I've got a chart that shows what current consumption is, and the values that are given beside each of the markers there are the grams of food that are consumed per day in each of those categories. And this piece of work by WWF as part of their Live Well plate looked at what a diet might look like in 2030, and by changing the amount of fruit and vegetables, the amount of carbohydrate that's in the diet, reducing animal protein, they were able to identify a 20% reduction in emissions just from changing the plate. So just to bring my presentation to an end, we need to tackle climate change now. Agricultural emissions are not simple. There are some easy wins out there where we've got activity happening across multiple sectors, but there are also some significant challenges. We're going to need to embrace technology, and that's going to cost. There will be a cost to the farmer, and we need to think about how the farmer is supported in doing that. It's going to be important that there's attention to detail. So farmers are going to need to address productivity as closely and tightly as they can, so there's no waste within the system on farm. But we're also going to have to think about some of these bigger scale changes to the diet. And can we work with those changes to make our food supply chain more efficient? Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for starting this off so strongly. You did speak about novel technologies, and you gave us some examples, but a lot of focused on cattle. And I was just wondering, what about other livestock and horticulture?
Yeah, so we tend to see that there's been an awful lot of focus in the cattle sector, the ruminant sector, because of the high contributions to overall emissions. The other sectors haven't had as strong a push. There's not been as big a consumer drive to demonstrate their changes. But we're starting to see more information coming out in these sectors. Feed is a really important thing for the other poultry, pigs, etc. Efficiency of production. And there's a recent report that's been published by AHDE that looks at the various different options that are available for pigs, potatoes and protected horticulture for reducing emissions. So we're starting to see more evidence come through.
Well, that's good to hear. Thank you so much again, and we'll see you at the end for our group Q&A. I'm now going to ask Jason to join us on camera. Hi, Jason. Oh, can you just make sure you've turned your... There we go. Now we can hear you. So Jason Gittings is Technical Director for Livestock at RSK ADAS, and he is a highly experienced consultant who works with a wide range of clients, including producers, trade associations, government departments, and agencies. His technical expertise centers on the poultry, meat, and egg production sectors, in which he's worked on numerous projects involving animal welfare and environmental issues, and the links between them. I'm now going to disappear off camera, and I will let you take it away.
Well, thank you, Lucy. Good afternoon, everybody. In this session, I want to consider the relationship between two key drivers for the UK livestock sector: climate impact and animal welfare, and try to highlight some of the complexities of meeting the requirements of one without having an adverse effect on the other. For many years, the need to meet consumer expectations for animal welfare has been an important factor in shaping the UK livestock sector. But sustainability and net zero targets are also a major consideration these days, of course, and to achieve net zero, farmers are going to need to minimise greenhouse gas emissions arising from their practices, and then provide a balance for the remaining emissions using mitigation measures. I don't intend to debate the impacts or indeed the benefits of livestock farming today, and neither is this a discussion of preferences for vegetarian or non-vegetarian diets. But as a starting point, we should recognise, as Sarah has said, that the livestock sector does contribute to climate change, as indeed does food production in general. The main emissions arising from livestock production relate to emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, mainly from ruminants, and nitrous oxide, mainly from manures. And with this in mind, it's clear that the livestock sector can also be part of the solution. As part of the move to net zero by 2050, the livestock sector will need to change and to adapt, partly to do its share of the heavy lifting that's going to be demanded by governments and supply chains. And it will also be in its own interests to do so. The UK livestock sector would be adversely affected by rising temperatures, by extreme weather events, and by periodic flood and drought conditions. And there's also a risk that meat eating could become socially unacceptable in some quarters, particularly if the sector is not seen to be adapting to changing needs. Because of the focus on reducing emissions and net zero, livestock farmers and others are increasingly starting to measure the carbon footprint of their activities, following the old saying that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And when farmers do this, there are some positive correlations between good animal welfare and low carbon footprint. For instance, where good welfare shows itself in terms of healthy animals and low mortality, then output is likely to be higher. On-farm mortality can be a real drain on both resource use and profits, and other inputs, and inputs would have been used without any saleable returns. With good welfare, animals may grow faster and reach slaughter weight quicker, or produce more progeny or livestock products, such as milk or eggs. And so emissions are likely to be lower per unit of output. In other cases, though, the links between what might generally be regarded as good welfare and low carbon footprint are more complex. For instance, the carbon footprint of a litre of milk from intensive dairy systems in which the cows are housed all year round and fed concentrate feeds is likely to be lower than that from cows that remain outdoors for all or most of the year, grazing mainly on grass. And similarly, the carbon footprint of upland raised sheep is likely to be comparatively high for the sector because their growth rate is lower than those receiving a higher nutrient density feed. And the feed conversion efficiency will be poorer. An added consideration, though, is that mountainous land may not be suitable for any other food producing purposes, and grazing by sheep may help to maintain certain rural landscapes and provide a public good. To some extent, the same may be said of beef production. And the irony is that UK outdoor produced beef could have a higher carbon footprint than feedlot beef produced in other countries, even after the emissions associated with long distance transport are factored in. As well as again opening up wider discussions about land use, conservation, and the visual appeal of a landscape with livestock in it, there's also the overriding issue of food security in this country and the knowledge that exporting parts of our livestock sector may lead to other difficulties. In the poultry sector, interactions between animal welfare and climate impacts are particularly complex. In the egg sector, in recent years, we've seen a real clear trend in growth of free-range systems at the expense of cage production. The trend is set to continue, with most larger retailers who currently sell enriched cage eggs being committed to discontinuing these sales by 2025. And ask the general public whether free-range or indoor egg production is the more sustainable, and most would probably say free-range. But if considered in terms of carbon footprint of producing a dozen eggs, most experts would agree that free-range has a higher carbon footprint. And there's two key reasons for this. Firstly, free-range hens typically eat more, and that's partly because of their greater activity, and also sometimes the need to insulate themselves from cold weather on UK ranges. And it's also because the number of saleable eggs is slightly lower, with some eggs being laid outside the nest box, for example, and greater potential for dirt contamination. But encouraging range use is consistent with good welfare and in meeting consumer expectations, and so it cannot be compromised. But the free-range egg sector does have one important advantage over indoor production, and that is in the availability of land, which may allow further mitigations to be introduced, so helping to get towards net zero. Turning to the chicken meat sector, and it has similar challenges in terms of meeting animal welfare and sustainability objectives. In general, the carbon footprint of chicken is low compared to other meats. This is mainly because of the remarkable ability of the modern broiler chicken to convert feed consumed into live weight. And this means that target live weight is reached at an earlier age, with a ton of live weight chicken being produced from around about 1.5 tons of compound feed. But some criticise the chicken meat sector and question whether welfare objectives are being fully met, given this high rate of growth and the typical stocking rates. This challenge is not just in the UK, but elsewhere too, including other parts of Europe and the United States. As a result, retailers, food service companies and others are all being encouraged to sign what is known as the Better Chicken Commitment. Amongst the main features of this are the use of a slower growing breed of bird. The change from a standard to a slow growing breed would mean that each bird would take longer to reach the final live weight and would eat more feed in the process. Around 2 years ago, ADAS was commissioned by the National Farmers Union, the NFU, to prepare a comparison of the economics and carbon footprint of chicken produced to normal red tractor standards and Better Chicken BCC standards. Our conclusions from the study, which has been published, were that the production costs of chicken produced to BCC standards would be around 18% higher than for a chicken produced to red tractor requirements. But more importantly, in terms of today's discussion, Sarah and our climate and sustainability group in ADAS made a comparison of the typical carbon footprint from the two systems. Physical performance parameters were developed by ADAS to be typical of each system. And the key assumptions that we made, having discussed with a number of people, were that feed intake would typically increase by around 3/4 kilogram per bird, 770 grams per bird, and that the growing cycle for each flock would increase by around 6 days. So the carbon footprint for each was calculated on the basis of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of live weight, and the results are shown in the table at the bottom there. So you can see that feed is the biggest contributor towards the carbon footprint, and that this and the other two elements, energy and manures, are both higher in the better chicken commitment than for red tractor production, and therefore the total is also higher. The conclusion from that particular study then is that the adoption of better chicken commitment standards would increase greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of live weight by something like 23% compared to red tractor on a per bird basis. So whilst consumers may be happier about the conditions in which chickens are kept, they may be less happy about the consequent increase in emissions. And it follows too that since more feed would be used to grow each bird, a greater land area would be needed for production, for crop production in total. The overall effects at national level, though, depend on whether chicken output levels remain as they currently are. And of course, that's a really important proviso that relates to meat production in general. It's recently been reported that meat consumption in the UK has dropped by around 17% in the last decade. And the recently published National Food Strategy has recommended a 30% reduction in meat consumption over the next 10 years. And so taken together, these two would at least reduce the overall impacts of livestock that are linked to the food that we eat in this country, but there would also be emissions resulting from what we choose to eat instead. However, this takes no account of the UK livestock sector's desire to trade and to export to other countries, and these would have economic benefits to the country, although would increase emissions within the UK. Whatever the outcome, the livestock sector will need to continue to improve technical efficiency, as it always has, within preferred production systems, and then use mitigation measures to provide a balance for the emissions produced. On this basis, there may be greater scope to accommodate what are considered to be higher welfare systems within a sustainable future for the livestock sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a really engaging presentation. We heard recently about there being a shortage of carbon dioxide for certain industries, including its use in livestock processing. Would that have an impact on animal welfare?
Yes, it's a really strange situation, isn't it? That, a lot of the focus has been on the need to reduce CO2 emissions globally, and that's been emphasized. But I think what those recent stories have shown is that carbon dioxide is actually used in some parts of the food industry. And we hear of its use, for instance, in manufacturing fizzy drinks and so on. And it's also used in the processing of certain animals, particularly poultry. Gas stunning with gases such as carbon dioxide is generally considered better for animal welfare. And that's partly because of the reduction in handling. You're not handling the birds prior to the other main alternative, which is electrical stunning. So yes, there would be some potential animal welfare issues. Hopefully the threat has been sort of lifted because of the reopening of these fertilizer manufacturing facilities, whereby CO2 is produced as a byproduct. So hopefully that shouldn't put animal welfare at risk going forward.
Thank you. And we will see you again at the end of the presentation, where we can be answering all your questions that we have coming in. Please keep them coming. We've got some great ones so far. Our final presentation is from Dr. Anne Bogle. Anne, if you could join us on screen. Hello.
Hello.
So Anne is Principal Soil Scientist at RSK ADAS, and she has over 25 years of experience in the research and development of policies on soil and nutrient management. She has a particular interest on the impacts of organic amendments and cover cropping on soil health, carbon storage and nutrient cycling. She's a FACTS qualified advisor and a fellow of the British Society of Soil Science. Looking forward to hearing what you've got to tell us, and I will disappear.
Thank you, Lucy. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so looking at what carbon does in soils, how it underpins soil functioning, and is therefore critical to the delivery of a range of public goods and services, including climate change adaptation and possibly mitigation. So soils are a really important carbon store. They hold almost 3 times as much carbon as the atmosphere and more than the vegetation and atmosphere combined. So we've got around 2,300 gigatons of carbon in soils, mineral soils, down to 3 meters. So that's excluding peats, compared to 800 gigatons in the atmosphere. Now, this store can either decrease in size and therefore be a source of carbon. It can increase in size and become a sink, or as in many cases where land use hasn't changed for many years, it can remain static, so at a steady state in equilibrium with the atmosphere. So you can see that changes in how those stocks carbon stocks in the soil change have an implication for either climate change intensification or climate change mitigation. So it's vital that we protect this store first and foremost. But I suppose the question when we come to net zero is, can we enhance it? And if so, how can we do that and where can we do that? And so by enhancing the soil carbon store, I mean carbon sequestration. So that's the net transfer of carbon from the atmosphere to the land, in this case soils, but obviously also vegetation. So if we think about where carbon is stored, it varies according to the soil type, your land use and your climate. So if we just look at the UK as an example, we have around about 4.5 million tonnes of carbon to a metre depth within our soils. And you can see from this map, the darker colours are where we have the most. So up in Scotland, Northern Ireland, the upland regions of England and Wales. And a little bit around here, the fens. This is lowland peat and upland peat largely. So the upland areas are also cold and wet, so that carbon doesn't decompose as quickly. But you can also see that actually the vast majority of England in particular has a much lower carbon density. This is associated with largely the agricultural grasslands and arable lands. But because of the land area, it's actually a significant carbon stock. If we look at this information slightly differently, so this is just looking by land use, the carbon stock in tonnes per hectare. You can see the semi-natural communities, so those are those moorlands, upland grasslands, peatlands. They hold the highest amount of carbon, whereas arable soils, the most intensively managed and disturbed communities, hold the least amount of carbon. And so therefore you would think that actually the greatest mitigation opportunities are within those arable landscapes with the lower carbon contents. But before I look at how we might go about increasing those carbon stocks, I just want to take a step back and look at the role and the importance of carbon in soils. What does it do when it's in a soil? So we have 2 forms of carbon in a soil. We have the inorganic form, so the carbonate minerals, so things like chalk. That's fairly static amount of carbon. The larger proportion is the organic carbon within soil, and that's what's involved in the global carbon budget and cycling. So that's the plant and animal derived carbon ultimately coming from photosynthesis. We also have the term, you would have heard people talk about soil organic matter, sometimes interchangeably with soil organic carbon. So soil organic matter is everything in that plant and animal remains within the soil. It's not just carbon. So it's about 50% carbon, but there's also nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, that kind of thing. So the carbon within the organic matter has often been described as the major currency within the soil system. It underpins the majority of soil functions. As you can see from this schematic here, so as well as a carbon store, the organic matter is a food source. It's the energy for the soil biology. That biology is involved in cycling nutrients, so it's important for soil fertility. But the biology is also involved in sticking together soil particles, in creating pores. So really important for soil structure and the movement of air and water. So what we see is soils with a higher carbon content have that improved soil structure, water holding capacity, improved biological activity and nutrient turnover. This in turn means that crops root better, they capture nutrients and water better. Runoff is reduced, erosion is reduced, as is waterlogging. And so you can see that actually has important implications for a whole load of different services. So as well as improving crop productivity, we get reduced flood risk, reduced emissions, and greater resilience to perturbations like climate change. Now, in order for that carbon to do all these things, it actually has to be used by the soil biology. So a large chunk of it is actually respired and lost. So we have these sort of conflicting things going on, and there's quite a significant debate about it. Do we want to hoard carbon, so we don't want to lock it up forever within the soil, or do we actually want to use that carbon to deliver all those other public goods and services? So on the one side, we've got stable carbon that's important for climate change mitigation. So that's how much carbon we've got in the stock of carbon, tons per hectare. And on the other side, we have this biologically active carbon that's used, that's respired, that's important for soil quality and health, and ultimately resilience to climate change, so adaptation. So what can we do? How can we improve carbon stocks, particularly perhaps in those arable situations? And so these are just a few practices, and I just want to really first emphasise that actually we've got a lot of carbon there. This is in the topsoil, 70 tonnes per hectare in a typical UK arable soil, for example. And you can see all these different practices around the side. They're really quite small amounts of carbon that we're adding or taking away from the soil. And so actually it's quite difficult to detect those differences on a year-by-year basis. So we can change our land use. Obviously, if we go the wrong way, if we plough out grasslands and take down forests, we lose carbon from the soil, whereas if we go in reverse, we gain carbon. We can change cultivation practices. So here, if we're ploughing annually, we can be losing carbon, whereas if we have no-till situations, we can gain small amounts of carbon. We can also grow high-yielding crops, return the residues from those crops, use cover crops. That can add small amounts of carbon too. And then finally, applying different organic materials, livestock manures, composts, etc., can add organic matter to the soil. So we've got a number of opportunities to add carbon to the soil, but can this help sequester and offset those emissions? Can it help us achieve net zero? And I would say it has some limitations. The first one being that actually changes in soil carbon are slow. They're also finite and they're also reversible. If we look at this just schematic about how carbon changes in soil over time, say, for example, if we adopt no-till, for example, we'll see that carbon content starting to increase. This increase can occur over around about a 20-year period, so it's not immediate, but it does, the rate of change does decline over time until we reach that new steady state. And then we can't accumulate any more carbon. So it won't accumulate indefinitely. Likewise, if we stop that practice, we will see that carbon start to decline back down again. And that can actually occur much more rapidly than the time period it took to actually gain that carbon. So practices must be maintained. We also have a number of other things to think about. So leakage and displacement. By that I mean, are we just moving carbon about? So in the case of farm manure applications, we're already applying pretty much all the manure that is produced in this country goes back to the soil in one way or another. So it's not new carbon. Likewise, if we are perhaps taking land out of cultivation, putting some woodland in, put some grassland in, do we have to then grow crops elsewhere in this country or abroad to compensate for the loss in food production? We also have to think about the potential for what I've called pollution swapping. So here I mean, do other pollutants, other greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, methane increase as a result of the practice of increasing soil carbon? And then finally, perhaps it's quite a sticking point, is can we reliably measure and verify and therefore account for those carbon changes? As you saw earlier, we're talking about small changes, and those changes are slow and soils are highly variable. So establishing those robust measurement, reporting and verification platforms for soil carbon is quite challenging. So just to conclude, I just want to emphasize how important soil carbon is and how big a story it is. So we need to protect it. That should be our #1 priority so that soil management doesn't contribute to climate change. Increasing soil carbon is always beneficial from an agricultural sustainability and a resilience and adaptation to climate change. And in some circumstances can offer climate change mitigation too. Those circumstances are probably arable soils and degraded grasslands and wetlands. And we do have a number of well-established carbon-friendly practices that we can consider. But we do need to be careful of all those issues I've just highlighted, particularly the fact that it can't go on indefinitely. And we can easily reverse what we've done. And we need to think about those trade-offs in terms of other pollutants, but also in terms of food security implications about what we might be doing. And I just really want to end by a final thought that carbon sequestration, whether that's in the soils or in vegetation, although it's really important, it should not distract from the need to reduce emissions. So it shouldn't be used as an excuse for business as usual. And I just want to highlight this science note on soil carbon that is just about to be published on Monday to coincide with the beginning of COP26, produced by the British Society of Soil Science. So you'll find it on their website from Monday. And that is a really excellent summary of all the things I have just been talking about and perhaps adding a little bit more flesh to the detail. And that's where I'd like to end it. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was absolutely fascinating. Given all the limitations you've described, does soil carbon have a role to play in achieving net zero?
I think most definitely yes is the answer to that question. It is a tool within our toolbox to help mitigate and adapt to climate change. I think I wanted to emphasize that it's not a quick fix. And I wanted to try and avoid overestimating the amount of carbon that can be stored up and sequestered in this way. As I've said, the priority should be to make sure that soil management practices don't actually contribute to climate change, so we protect what we've got already, and then look to target particular areas where we can enhance soil carbon, not only to capture that carbon, but actually to improve resilience and soil health and all those other benefits that I've mentioned.
That makes sense. Thank you. I'm going to get you to stay on your camera as it's now time for our group Q&A. So if everyone else could please join us back on screen. Thank you. We've had a lot of questions through, so we will try our best to make our way through as many as possible. Our first one is, as methane has a much shorter life than CO2 in the atmosphere, will there be a point that growing food in heated greenhouses has a higher climate impact than grazing ruminants? I don't know if any of you want to tackle that first.
I'll start with that. I think it probably depends upon scale. So, for example, there is a lot less heated glass houses than there are ruminant livestock. So in terms of scale, livestock is still going to be the biggest impact because there's so many more of them. The thing with methane and its short lifespan in the atmosphere is the fact that it actually offers us an opportunity to cool the atmosphere. If we stop producing carbon dioxide now, it's going to linger about in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and its impact will be there for future generations. If we stop producing methane now, disappears in 10 years' time, we can actually start to cool the atmosphere. So they'll have different impacts.
Does anyone else have anything to add? If not, I will make our way to the next question.
I think you summed it up nicely, Sarah.
So the next question is, Jason indicates intensive production has lower carbon footprint, but part of that is due to feed concentrate. What of the carbon footprint of producing that food relative to natural vegetation growth? So perhaps Jason, you could start us off with that.
Yes, I think the situation with sort of intensive versus extensive is a really interesting one, and it's not always work out the way that you think it naturally should, really. I think, you know, what the issue is probably that with high yielding systems, the carbon footprint per litre or per unit of live weight or whatever it is tends to be relatively low because of the efficiency of the process, really. So I think that's always the difficulty for people to understand. So when inputs are spread over, you know, more outputs, it changes the ratios, obviously, and so the carbon footprint usually looks better with the more intensive systems.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we actually have a couple of questions that are directed specifically to panelists. So Anne, this one is directed towards you, but obviously everyone else can weigh in as well. Regarding soil carbon, how bad is the cultivation of crops for energy, i.e. corn for biogas or straw for ethanol, as it feels it is some sort of carbon mining from soil to the atmosphere?
That's a good question. So a lot of bioenergy crops are actually permanent crops. So short rotation coppice, that kind of thing, miscanthus, they're in the ground for a lot longer than an annual crop, and actually from a soil carbon perspective, that's a good thing to do. I think the question is, what is that land that you're growing the biofuel on? What would be the other use of that land from a food production point of view? Are we taking food out of the system to grow that bioenergy? But from a soil carbon point of view, a lot of bioenergy crops, as I say, if they're permanent crops or short rotation, they're in the ground for longer, and they're good from a soil carbon point of view because you're not disturbing the system.
Sarah or Jason, do you have anything else to add to that? Otherwise we can keep going with the questions. Okay, so the next one, I think actually, Sarah, perhaps you could start us off with this one. In terms of collecting data further down the food chain, Is there any standardized scheme that farmers can work to, which can then follow the animal product through to processors so that manufacturers or retailers can make informed decisions around balancing cost with reduced carbon emissions?
Oh, now there's the panacea, I think. It would be great if there was a standardized scheme. There is consistent guidance in terms of the information that comes from things like IPCC, but when you've got various carbon calculators out there, and there are many, they then interpret that guidance and are put on different assumptions to that guidance, which mean that you get fractionally different answers. I would like to think the majority of those tools, whatever the tool is, will give similar answers in terms of where the challenges are. But when we come to measuring emissions using a carbon calculator, I tend to see them as really a decision support tool rather than an absolute quantification of the emissions, because they are, by their very nature, making big assumptions about what's happening. But no, there is no one single methodology yet.
I think it is a useful basis for the start of a discussion, though, isn't it? I think that's the sort of important point, is to start that discussion, start to look at the inputs, look at where the sort of hotspots are, and then start to manage them and deal with them afterwards, really. But I think, as Sarah says, you know, there is not just one system that one would just go automatically to.
Mm-hmm. So our next question I'm going to throw out to everyone again. How can we support environmental changes in countries we source from who have not yet gone through their industrial revolutions, areas, for example, in Southeast Asia? Who wants to tackle that first?
So how can we support them? Well, I think some of it is through sharing some of the best practice learnings that we've already got. We've been through that process. We've gone through the dirty phase. We're now trying to get through to a clean phase. So as they go through their industrial revolution, can they skip the dirty phase and move straight into the clean phase? Mm-hmm. So I think it is a lot about trying to learn from the mistakes that we've made and what we're doing now to make sure that actually they can make that bigger jump without having to take all the steps in between that we've had to do.
Mm-hmm. I think some of that work is going on, isn't it, really, by supply chains in this country. There's much more interest these days in terms of, you know, learning where our supplies come from, whether it's soya or other products, really. And I think that is starting to encourage that debate again, which is perhaps the starting point for things anyway.
Mm. And sourcing our food from, you know, knowing the practices have been sustainable and having that two-way sort of conversation, really.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Unfortunately, we've already run out of time. Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and obviously to everybody for joining and asking such brilliant questions. As you all know, the most critical climate conference yet, COP26, starts this Sunday and will run until the 12th of November. This is a much anticipated event with governments and businesses from across the globe coming together to discuss how we can cut emissions in line with 1.5, as the latest climate science warns us we must urgently do. But what about the role of nature? Well, RSK will be at COP26 and we will be bringing business leaders from across multiple sectors together to work out how we can finalize the Paris rulebook and cut emissions in line with 1.5 degrees, while of course protecting and restoring the natural resources on which humanity and obviously businesses depend. You can join us live on YouTube from the comfort of your own home or your office by visiting the link in the chat box. And post COP26, we'll be keeping this conversation going. We've had great success with our panels, so do keep a lookout for reports, webinars, and more from us in 2022 and beyond. Thank you again to everyone for joining and to the brilliant insights we've heard today. And just a quick reminder as well to fill out the feedback survey that you will receive an hour after the webinar. And our experts are going to try and answer all of the questions that we didn't get time to ask today. Thank you so much again, everyone, and enjoy COP26.
Thank you.